So distressed properties is something that we have not really dealt with in the market in a meaningful way in quite a few years. There's sporadically foreclosures, sporadically short sales on the market, but we've not really seen a lot of that yet. And now what's going to start to happen is we'll start to see buyers being interested in it because they think that the market is tanking, because that's what the media is telling them. So we need to be able to be educated to help instruct our clients on what it is. So when I say a distressed property, I typically mean anything that is a foreclosure, which is a bank-owned property. So sometimes that's referred to as REO, like real estate owned, and or a short sale. And a short sale is typically where the owner, the actual person still owns the property, but they owe more on the property than what it's worth after closing costs, etc. So they owe more on the property than what the value of it is. And so from that perspective, those are called distressed because it is an owner who is in trouble, or it was an owner that was in trouble. And so the property has become distressed. One of the things that Angel had reached out to me about was last week, he had somebody who was all excited because they saw a property that was a pre-foreclosure. And a pre-foreclosure, what happens with that, just I want to make sure everybody understands the process. If somebody is late on their mortgage, the bank, if they want to start the foreclosure process, the very first thing that they need to do is send out what's called a notice of lis pendens. And if you remember from real estate school back in the day, that is it's Latin for litigation pending, right? That there is potential litigation that is coming down the pipe. And that is what the bank is required to do as the very first step in any potential foreclosure proceedings. They cannot foreclose on a house without sending out that notice. Well, that notice is a public notice. Okay, so that notice is filed with the county and everybody becomes aware of that. And so that's where you start to have the Zillows of the world and other websites that say, we've got a pre-foreclosure. And so the pre-foreclosure, the lis pendens, has absolutely nothing to do with the property being available for sale. I want to repeat that because it's really important. A lis pendens or a pre-foreclosure has nothing to do with the property being for sale. It does not mean it is for sale. What Zillow and the other lead gen companies do is they get the public excited about a potential great deal on a property so that they can generate more leads. That's why they do that. And so all of our customers at some point, well, many of our customers at some point will ask about that if they're doing any of their own, searching. Hey, I saw this pre-foreclosure over here. And so our communication is, telling them what I just did about what it actually means, and then helping them understand that it could become, it could come for sale at some point. It is not at the moment, but the owner could literally get caught up next week on the mortgage, and then they would release that lis pendens, and then they just go on and live their life. Like, that is a possibility. The owner could refinance, and then they lift the lis pendens. There's a lot of ways to get out of a lis pendens. It doesn't mean that the house is going to foreclosure. It means that the first step was taken to go down the path if it goes to foreclosure. And by the way, the foreclosure process, I don't know how long it is today, but in the past, like, that could be a year and a half, longer than that, until the bank actually actually goes before the county and claims the property through that process. And then even when that happens, if the bank decides to take the property back as an REO, they still don't have to put it on the market, right? There's a lot of banks who foreclose on properties and they just don't do anything about it for months and months and months on end. And it just sits there, it sits there vacant and rotting. And, that's just kind of the process. So even if it gets foreclosed on, it does not mean that it's for sale. And so the easiest thing for us to do is to look through the properties that are in the MLS that are for sale. But if there is a list pendens that was filed, there's nothing stopping you from reaching out to that owner and asking, hey, I've got a potential buyer for the property. Would you consider the idea of selling? There's nothing stopping you from reaching out to that owner, but they've not raised their hand and said that I want to sell. Okay, so I would certainly use that opportunity to reach out and do, some circle prospecting, or to reach out to that owner and see if you can get them to sell. But that house is not technically for sale. Okay. Now, the difference between a short sale and a foreclosure is substantial. We already talked a lot about a foreclosure and how that works. When it comes to, there's more to get there as far as the buying at the courthouse steps. A lot of people want to buy, they want to buy at the courthouse steps of foreclosure. And I'll give a little bit of background on that too, to help that conversation. That is feasible. There are properties that do change hands. It is not done at the courthouse steps any longer. So it's all done at an online auction that the county hosts. And you can sign up for it. You can look at all the properties that are coming up for foreclosure. I think that website is for Lee County, it's lee.realforeclose.com. So lee.realforeclose.com is the Lee County website. And you can register and then look at the calendar, and it'll tell you every property that's coming up to the auction block over the course of the next few months. If your client is very interested in that, and a lot of investors get very interested in that, there are some substantial risks to buying this way. So a huge risk is that you typically don't have any kind of a title search. And so unless you have, a title agent in your back pocket, which we could talk about, but unless that happened, that buyer could be buying into all kinds of additional liens against the property. So they could have homeowner association liens in the tens of thousands of dollars that they haven't paid. They could have IRS tax liens against the property that need to be taken care of. They could have other title defects, and all of that risk is taken on the buyer when they buy a foreclosure through the county. The buyer is the one who takes all of that risk. Then what happens is, so you go through all of this due diligence and effort on this property. The day of the auction comes, the bank who would be getting the property back, they have a minimum bid that they set for the property, and you have no idea what that minimum bid is or could be. And so people bid on the property of what they're willing to do, and then they don't get it. The bank just says, we'll just take it back. Right. So that happens a large majority of the time. The other thing that happens a large majority of the time is the properties are pulled from the auction. So they don't even go to the auction. So it is a very challenging thing. And quite frankly, it's something from a liability perspective that we really should not be very involved in, just because it's just so much risk for the buyer. And unless we have a buyer rep agreement, you're not getting paid on it anyway. So it's just super risky. My recommendation on this is that we educate the client about what those potential risks are, and then offer some alternatives as well, because you can get absolutely spit up and shoot out. I have the best story ever about this. There was a person who had contacted me last year, and he was a newbie investor. This newbie investor, super interested in distressed properties, wanted to buy from the county, et cetera. And it was like him and his buddy out in Colorado who had a few dollars that they wanted to spend and do flips. They go to, they do some due diligence, some due diligence on properties. They find one that's off Three Oaks that the numbers look really, really good. And it was a single family home. And I think they bought it for like $165,000. And they, looked on Google Maps for what it had, sold for. They went on Zillow to see the Zestimate, all these things. And, they were really going to just do exceptionally well. They ended up winning the property. So they actually went through with the auction. They bought the property. They went by the property and to check it out. And last year, the property burnt down. There was no house there. Absolutely no house there at all. And so I get a phone call after this all happened, and he's like, what do we do? What do we do with? And I was like, I don't know. What do you do? I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you. You can build a house on it, try to sell the land, try to get out from under it. But like that's just like, you're stuck, you're stuck at that point. And it was a situation where he thought it was an amazing deal and nobody was bidding on it because there was no damn house on it. And like Lee County still had the old house pictures on it. And he assumed that the house was still there and it had burnt down. So like, that's the kind of horrible stories and things that can happen to an uneducated investor. And so we just need to do our best to communicate to them what those risks are. Like, can you imagine? I can't imagine like that feeling in that guy's stomach as soon as he went by there and saw that situation. So that is a fairly good rundown on foreclosures. Lisa Bender, do you have anything that you would add into that? Or anybody else for that matter?
I would just say, a buyer beware when it comes to foreclosures. The more research the buyer can do and you can do. I actually had a nightmare situation where one came up and buyer bought it and there was an IRS tax lien for more than the value of the property and it didn't hit and we couldn't find it. And it popped up a week after closing.
Wow.
And luckily, the buyer was able to track down the previous owner of the property that actually ended up settling it. But the buyer could have been responsible for it because there was that lien on the property.
And so was that from the courthouse, like that they bought it before it was REO?
Yeah.
Okay. The much safer bet for people to buy is the REO, right? If a property is a foreclosure that is in the MLS, that means the bank already owns it and you're going to get title, right? You're going to get title insurance on the property, and that would help protect a situation like that, that came up for Lisa's customer there. So an REO is much safer, and for all purposes, it runs much like a traditional sale. You submit an offer typically over to the listing agent, but most of the times they have some kind of platform that you're going to submit it through. A lot of times the banks do that. So you have to go online and submit, the buyer info and the contracts on an online portal, but it's the same kind of negotiations. It's just, there's no emotions. Like the bank has no emotions on it whatsoever. In the past, they typically would have an asking price that they would put in the MLS. They wouldn't accept anything less than what the asking price was. And at 30 days, if it hadn't sold, they would do a price reduction. And then that would be the new benchmark. And then after 30 days, they would lower it again. And then they would just go until they would get it. Now, that's a generality. That's not the rule, but that's just sort of the way things used to work. So that's REO. And in the MLS, you have the ability to do a search and it'll say foreclosed as one of the options. And you can say yes. Right? We want to see what what foreclosures are available out there. Short sale. Yep. Go ahead, Lisa.
Sorry. I would also take a look. I mean, if you guys are looking at that, see what type of deed is actually transferring with the property.
Most of the time it's a special warranty deed. And a special warranty deed has some pretty substantial limitations that come with it. It's much different than a general warranty deed, but a special warranty deed is basically saying like, we'll insure it from here on and not going back in time forever. Good call. Short sales. So short sales are so much fun. Oh my goodness. I love short sales. So what many don't know, so my wife actually, she used to be the short sale manager at Winged Foot Title back in 2009 and 10, I think like 2008, 9 and 10, something like that. And they did thousands of short sales, literally thousands of them. And she was like the manager of the entire department who did all of these. And so I got a really good intimate knowledge of what short sales are and were at that time. As I had mentioned previously, a short sale is still owned by the seller. So they own the property. They're upside down typically. And they don't want to go to foreclosure because a foreclosure typically stays on your credit for 7 years until, which time that reaches the statute of limitations and then falls off. And so, and in a foreclosure, the bank can, in a lot of cases, go after you for what they lost out on that deal. So that is a possibility. A short sale is a seller who's saying like, listen, bank, I come in peace. I am not able to, I have some kind of a hardship. In a short sale, you need some kind of a hardship. And that could be an illness, that could be a loss of job, that could be a lot of different things. But I'm no longer able to afford this home and I'm underwater. And I'd like to work with you to sell the house and get out from underneath it. That's essentially what it comes down to. And it's cheaper for the bank to do a short sale because a foreclosure takes a long time. The bank's going to have a significant time without that person paying, and they have to pay substantial attorney fees to do the foreclosure proceedings. And a short sale is an agreement between parties where we don't have to have all the attorneys in courts and involved, etc. And so what happens here is that if you're looking at a listing that is a short sale, the price that they're asking is usually not already agreed by the bank. It can be, and if it is, they would say like bank approved price, but many times it is not. So many times what happens in a short sale is that the listing agent and seller put the property at a price that would attract buyers. And then you submit an offer to your buyer, submits an offer over to the seller. The seller has to agree to the contract first and foremost. So the seller needs to agree to the contract. There's additional addenda that go along with the short sale. So there's a short sale addendum, and that basically says like this contract is subject to the third party lender approval. And then what happens is they get all of their paperwork, all the executed contract. They get all the documentation from the seller saying like, I truly do have this hardship. They have to provide all of their bank statements, they have to put together this whole big story, and they submit everything over to the bank. At that point, the bank would start their due diligence, and they would typically send out somebody to do a BPO, which is a broker's price opinion. And then they would come up with what they believe a good value on the home would be. And then the bank could come back and they could counter offer. Even though the seller's already accepted the deal, the bank can counter offer the buyer, or they can accept, or they can reject. Like they have not approved it. And so a short sale is really never a great idea for an end user to buy who has any kind of a time frame. Right? If it's a second home purchase, whatever, not the end of the world. But if somebody's like, hey, I'm looking to sell my home and I need to move into this home at this point, a short sale is not a good idea. It's just really not a good idea because timeframes are impossible to predict. I've had some that went from offer to closing in like 42 days, somewhere in that range. And I have had some that took a year and a half to negotiate and then never closed. Like I literally worked on it for a year and a half and never closed.
Can I chime in?
Sure.
My first house here in Fort Myers, we bought as a short sale. And when we put the offer in, I was newly pregnant with my second child. And the day we closed, he turned 8 months old. So it took 15 months for us to close on that. And that was back like in 2012.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy, but that's absolutely, at least you closed, right? Because back in the day when they just had, I mean, it was just stacks and stacks and stacks of short sales, and it was like, if you're on the bottom of the stack, you just tell all parties, we'll be in touch as soon as we hear anything from the bank. And like, months could go by, like just months could go by with absolutely nothing. You call and pester, and sometimes I felt like that made you go farther to the bottom of the pile because they didn't care. So, it's a brutal thing if there's any kind of time constraints. So not a good thing for an end user, as I had mentioned. It is possible. Yeah. I mean, Samantha has a success story where she purchased a short sale and that worked out. I know you got a great deal on that and sold it for good money. So that did work out, but they've got to have a plan B for housing. They've got to have a plan B. And the other thing that I would do is, if your client is looking and has a short sale under contract, I would just continue looking for property. I wouldn't just give up and stop at that point. So that, I think that's a good overview of the two possibilities. REO is the best kind of foreclosure because it's already in the MLS, and that makes it easy. Submit an offer over like normal. Short sale that's typically going to be listed in the MLS already. You're going to submit an offer over like normal, just with an additional addendum to it. That means that it's subject to the third-party lender approval. And the other thing that I would typically do, and I would put all time frames start once the third-party lender approves the short sale. And the reason for that is because, if you've got a big deposit down and it takes 9 months, well, that person's, not having access to their money for 9 months. You don't want to spend money on inspections or appraisals or even start the financing or anything until the third-party lender approves. And so it just helps protect the buyer from them spending money on a property that we don't know with 100% certainty that they're even going to have a contract on that was approved by the lender. What questions do we have?
Not so much question, but that short sale doesn't seem so short.
No. I mean, that was always the joke, right? Like everybody would say, "Oh, it's a long sale." Like, well, yeah, they call it a short sale because it's a short payoff. So they're shorting their payoff of the mortgage by a certain amount of money.
Thanks for clarifying that, especially with the foreclosures. Now I know to look out for that. Just go to MLS, make sure it's legit before I even waste my time with it.
Yeah. And a lot of I've seen a lot of the banks using like auction.com and different auction websites these days. So what I would do from that perspective is go to those websites, look up the property, understand what the compensation is in the MLS for it. And many times they do require that the broker register their client. So if you do have a client who is interested in bidding on something like on auction.com or any of the other auction websites, then you may have to fill out something to pre-register that client in order for them to pay you a commission on it. Just be aware of that.
Do these things ever go smoothly?
You mean all distressed sales? Do they ever go smoothly?
Is there ever a case where you just, you get your offer in, it's accepted by seller and bank, and just move forward?
Yeah,
Possible.
Like a foreclosure. Yeah, I feel like a foreclosure is much more cut and dry than a short sale.
Yeah, it's possible. And like I have, actually it was Jody's condo in Renaissance that she bought. They bought it as a short sale, and I don't remember how long it took, but it was literally like never lived in and in pristine condition. Like it was just this amazing property. So distress doesn't always mean that it's I'll just say it, a shithole, but like it just means that the circumstances around the sale are distressed. Now, most of the time, the property itself is distressed because you've got somebody who financially is having trouble and they don't want to spend any more money on that property. And that also brings up another point about short sales, is that your inspection process is typically brutal. And I say that because the seller has no motivation to fix anything or put any more money into the property. Like they're over it, they're done, they don't have, they're already in a distressed situation. And so like the communication to the buyer is, we'll get an inspection, but it's basically so that you can say yes or no. Because I don't want you to have any expectation that the seller, because the seller's really not got any skin in the game. They don't, they're not going to get any of the money coming out of this transaction. And so to ask them to replace an air conditioner or to do this, do that, there's just a very, very low likelihood that anything happens there. So the
Well, and
inspection is so
same
that
with
you can make a yes
foreclosure.
or a no.
Right? Like same with the foreclosure, because typically the bank is not going to do any repairs or anything.
Sometimes they'll give credit though. Like I've seen the banks give credit on things before. I had a situation, it was Hawthorne Woods. So that was a foreclosure, and I mean, gosh, I'm super glad we did all the inspection stuff, because it was like the septic was bad. There was a lot of like high level things that were very expensive. Wow. Marion Smith is calling me right now. That's ironic. So they're like, we went and brought before them a report of like, here are your issues. And the bank, they can give a credit or a price reduction in that circumstance. Whereas the seller on a short sale is much, much less likely to do that. So most of the time they won't do repairs, and most of the time you don't want them to do the repairs, as from a foreclosure perspective, but I've seen them give credits.
Hey, Brad, redemption periods and foreclosures. I mean, I know that's a complicated, confusing thing, but I've had a few that have actually gone into foreclosure, and we were able to sell at a higher value during that redemption period, and then just pay the bank off what that agreed upon price was per se, during that redemption period.
I have not had anything to do with the redemption period at all. So I don't know. I'd have to
Okay.
get back to you on that.
Yeah, it's just based on the type of property, there's a certain amount of time that the seller per se, the property owner, can actually redeem the property and get it back out of foreclosure. And if you can sell within that period of time, the foreclosure gets canceled and just moves on. As long as the bank is paid back what they're owed.
Like in a tax lien situation like the redemption period, that I know that's a lot more common in that situation.
Yeah.
Once it
I'm
actually
talking more that-
transacts at foreclosure, like once it actually at county level, once it actually transacts, I don't know. Like I don't know how much time that is. And if
Yeah,
there is
it
one.
just depends. It's either 6 months or a year, depending on the type of property, how much acreage. But typically, if it's gone to quote sheriff's sale for the foreclosure, if that amount at the sheriff's sale is less than what you can actually get for the property, you can actually pay off what was bid at sheriff's sale to the bank, and your seller can keep the remainder.
Got it.
So they're actually walking away and their foreclosure halts. So there's no
Okay.
foreclosure on their
Yeah.
record.
So it says, I'm just reading up on that real quick. It says, up until the clerk files the certificate of sale, a homeowner can save his or her home from the foreclosure. And so that's like a matter of like, that would be very quick.
Yeah, it just depends on when the bank files the initial paperwork versus when they actually file for sale.
Absolutely, yeah. And so I agree with that. I'm saying once the county sale happens, then there's not, like, that sounds like that redemption period is a matter of the certificate being filed, and that's that. So that, we wouldn't bank on that being a possibility.
No, it's just something to look at, like how far in the foreclosure process are, is the bank at? Did they just initially get the documentation notice on the door? Or has it actually been processed through the court system for foreclosure.
I've had sellers who reach out to me saying like, listen, I've got a court date and I need to, like, I want to short sale my property. And there's been times where I'm like, listen, I'll do everything that I can, but I cannot guarantee you a single thing here. And so like, I've gone through that process of listing a property, getting a contract, submitting the short sale over, and the bank came back and said, nope, we're just going through with the foreclosure. Tough luck. And so then it was just, they just came in too late, and the bank isn't forced to accept a short sale either. So
No.
it's, and if they've already invested all of their money into the foreclosure process, sometimes they say, we're just better off just taking the property back. Has this been helpful?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. All right. Any other questions about distressed properties?